Thank you very much, Dr. Baum, and members of the audience. It's an amazing opportunity to be back at the ZK Matthews Hall and to be here for this wonderful occasion. I've been asked to make an introductory statement. In Plato's The Republic, a perfectly just and democratic state could be realized by philosophers becoming kings, or the kings or rulers of any city becoming philosophers. A philosopher was distinguished as a lover of learning and knowledge and truth. He had the intelligence to make the distinction between reality as forms that are constant and particulars that are changeable. A.D. Lindsay, the translator of my version of Plato, says that those who only recognize those things they can see and touch have no knowledge, but only belief and superstition. They only know half-truth, that is half real, and that is imperfect, and that is changing, and that is unstable. Expanding on this theme, Plato writes that then he who is to be a good and noble guardian of our city will be by nature philosophical and spirited, quick and strong. It must therefore be someone with energy, vision, intelligence, wisdom, and who understands power. But beyond that, it had to be people who do not simply prioritize their own self-interest, but those of the city. Then, says Plato, from among the guardians we must select those men, those days they were men, who we think on inquiry have excelled all their life long in doing zealously whatever they thought was for the city's interests, and in refusing resolutely to do what they thought was to its harm, unquote. As we know, there is much distrust and even contempt for thinkers and intellectuals, pejoratively named philosopher kings. In this country, in the immediate aftermath and euphoria of the Polokwane Revolution, we were almost egged on to despise the educated elite and have contempt for them. It is charged that they are not in touch with reality, and rather, much to the contrary of Plato, that they are not common men or women, and they are not to be trusted because they can be too clever. And you see, by so doing, we have institutionalized mediocrity. And we have made virtue out of dullness and stupidity and madness. But in truth, it has not always been so. Africa's liberation pioneers were demonstrably intellectual giants of their time. Jomo Kenyatta, the anthropologist, was facing Mount Kenya as he waged war against the British imperialists and led Kenya to uhuru. Ahmed Ben Bella in Algeria, and even the military men like Abdul Nasser in Egypt, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Patrice Lumumba, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, Faustinho Neto, Eduardo Mondlane, and almost all the leaders of the ANC over its 100 years history until recently had a particularly strong intellectual. The late Achima Fedje saw fit to distinguish between the intellectuals in the Gramscian sense of public intellectuals, meaning people given to reason and learning as political tools and strategies, and the intelligentsia, meaning professional intellectuals, who, in his words, engage in critical and independent thinking within society. Amilcar Cabral, for example, says of Kwame Nkrumah, who had been overthrown in a military coup d'etat and exiled in Guinea-Conakry as a guest of Sékou Touré when he died, and I quote, "We hail Nkrumah, the philosopher and thinker, because he could apply himself to consequent practice. We pay homage to the pioneer of Pan-Africanism, to the tireless, constantly inspired combatant of African unity. We pay homage to the avowed enemy of neocolonialism in Africa and elsewhere, to the strategists of the economic development of his country," unquote. To him, Cabral attributed the development of positive action, which he called the most appropriate solution to the struggle against imperialism in Africa. The positivists of that time understood that they had to be informed and knowledgeable about their reality. They had to understand the strengths of their people, including their histories and cultures, and then they could call on the sacrifices of their people on the basis of a shared vision for the future. What Archie Mafeja observed is a truism, that intellectual cycles in Africa have a very short lifespan. The onset of liberation was driven by a fervor for Pan-Africanism and a New Deal for Africa. And within a space of about 5 years, we were in the horrors of military dictatorships and one-party states and authoritarian rule. That was a time that saw the flight of African intellectual capital and the destruction of universities, an ideology that was fueled more by the East-West ideological conflicts, and Africa became the theater of struggle of the elephants, and the grass that suffers were the ordinary people of the continent. In some ways, the establishment of the OAU in 1963 brought promise of African solidarity and a common struggle against colonialism. Now, 50 years later, colonialism retreated from Africa with the defeat of apartheid in South Africa. But more and more dangerous forms of neocolonialism hover menacingly above Africa's horizon. But we do well to remember that time in 1963 as the beginnings of Africa's rites of passage, from a state of innocence to one of experience. Perhaps the period between 1963 and 2002, the birth of the African Union, could be the middle passage of a kind. The end of this period, however, was presenting Africa with a new set of challenges. For one thing, international affairs were taking a drastic turn, both in terms of the geopolitical environment as well as the emerging expressions of the world order and development. The then prevailing partnerships with failed African states was under strain. Secondly, in Africa itself, there were emerging new leaders, some of whom were without roots in the independence struggles, and they were raising new questions about Africa's responsibilities for her own history and future. With the death of apartheid, Africans could then attend to a new set of challenges about their relations among themselves and the legacy of the colonial past that divided Africa into spheres of influence. Within Africa, there was a restive populace that was asking some hard questions about the nature of Africa's democracy and the demands for a new philosophy of rights and democracy and a new philosophy of leadership. I suggest, therefore, that much of what Africa had been about was no longer adequate. In this environment, autocratic generals turned civilian rulers were always going to arouse suspicion, and that the democratic ideal in Africa would remain inchoate, and the democratic push would be relentless. At a philosophical level, this, I suggest, meant that African studies were having to raise old questions afresh, but with increased determination. The social and historical method was under renewed interrogation. The application of Western paradigms of knowledge in Africa was proving inadequate to address the mood then prevailing in the continent. And it had become necessary for African intellectuals to reconstruct an Africa and its thought structures. In the postmodernist and reconstructive environment, the validity of the theoretical conclusions had to be re-evaluated in the light of new understandings about and in whose service they had been developed or served, and indeed how the interests of Africa had been subordinated to Western interests. Within that paradigm, it was urgent that the character of the power relations formed as a result of the theoretical preconceptions needed to be unraveled. And so Ren Greenstein puts it, that although objective truth cannot be achieved, one can strive for detaching the power of truth from the forms of hegemony, social, economic, and cultural, within which it operates at the present time, unquote. In other words, power relations were being exposed for what they were, and new relations of power constructed with, hopefully, a fulcrum set in the African idea. With that also, there had to be a renewed African idealism that the philosopher rulers of the past had managed to instill in Africa, but to search for a more lasting idealism in the face of challenges by a variety of power interests. A search for explanations was therefore underway, rather than absolutes and certainties. The truth was that Africa needed to establish new foundations and boundaries of knowledge about herself, buffeted by a world of ideas, determined to exploit and mine whatever could be of benefit to other nations. From the point of view of historical social science, Achima Fedje, in a celebrated essay that established the mood at this time, tries to discover whether there is any quality and capacity of intellectual participation in Africa that could unearth the possibility of the possible, of the impossible. He held that philosophical and social revolutions are contingent on scientific revolutions. Therefore, in his view, there had to be a marriage between Africa-specific science and science that determines socio-political activity. Africans cannot possibly build Africa on the basis of ideas generated from outside of its own history, culture, and politics. He also makes a telling point. He also makes the telling point that whatever we might believe about the independence and origins of social scientific thought, it is invariably a product of its own social circumstances. Social thought emerges out of and with the social revolutions of her time, which it may interrogate, shape, and challenge. He then concludes, and I quote, "For the social scientists, artists, and philosophers, the intellectual task of identifying, evaluating, and synthesizing popular cultural notions, various progressive nationalist and socialist preconceptions, and demands is a Herculean task, but not impossible. A beginning has been made. Might not," he concludes, "the African twilight have come for aspirant radical African intellectuals to take off?" The point one makes here is that however imperceptibly the emergence of South Africa into the African governance system and culture of ideas unleashed a new energy and idealism into the African consciousness about herself and about her place in world affairs. It was therefore not surprising that the period since 1994 saw the flowering of new developments and new life into the OAU and Africa, among whom was the democratization and human rights ideals, the legitimacy of elections and electoral processes, the need to take control and amass Africa's intellectual capital, and migrate artifacts and cultural pieces in various capitals of the world, and to appreciate Africa's own historical and cultural and scientific resources.